Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming out. So the title of my talk today is Integrative Medicine Can Fix Your Depression. So who's heard the term integrative medicine before? Who's heard the term functional medicine before? Okay, so this is going to be a talk educating you about integrative or functional medicine. And in my experience from being around the field for a while, functional medicine is the future of medicine now. It helps us, instead of treating symptoms, identify what's wrong at a root causal level, fix that to get symptom reduction. So what I'm going to do here today is going to be sort of to educate you about depression, about what conventional treatment is for depression, and then what the future is going to look like, I think, or what the future should look like. So here's some statistics about depression. 15 million American adults are diagnosed with depression each year. That's 6.5% of the U.S. population 18 and older. And around the World Health Organization says there's at least 300 million people who suffer from depression worldwide. In the U.S., over 30,000 people die by suicide each year. So this is every year. This is a serious problem, and it's actually kind of only getting worse. So what do we do? What's standard treatment for depression? Standard treatment tends to be psychiatric drugs, and there are classes of drugs. It's called the SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and SNRIs, selective serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. And these are household names. So you guys have heard of them because their commercials are all over the place. Prozac, Paxil, Wellbutrin, Zoloft. So they're ubiquitous terms. You know, virtually everyone has heard the term Prozac before. And then there's psychotherapy. There's talk ways and different kinds of modalities where relationship and different tools help with depression. So I'm a psychotherapist mostly, and I'm also interested in nutrition. And this talk is going to be focused much more on the biomedical part of it, the sort of drug part of it. It's going to sort of leave therapy out, not because therapy isn't important, but because this is sort of a critique of how are we doing with the physical aspects of treating depression. So according to the U.S. government, 11% of Americans over 12 are taking antidepressants. That's 11%. That's 1 out of every 10 people. And antidepressants are the second most prescribed class of drugs after statins. So in 2010, which is the most recent statistic I could find, there were 254 million prescriptions written in the United States. Do you guys know how many people live in the United States? About 300 million, 310 million. So there were almost as many prescriptions written for antidepressants as there were people in the United States. That's staggering to me. So what does that mean, and what should that mean? It should mean that there are no depressed people anymore. So if antidepressants were hugely effective, it would mean that there would be no depressed people. And when the first antidepressant hit the market, it was Prozac. It was in about, I think, 1987, and that was the promise. The promise on Time magazine it was a picture of Prozac, and it was the end of depression. There wasn't going to be any more depression. But what did we just say? There's 300 million people diagnosed newly depressed every year. There's something wrong with that. So how are we doing in our efforts? I would say probably not very well. So who's heard of the DSM? DSM is it's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's a huge book that codifies every single diagnosis. So there's anxiety disorders and depression disorders and borderline personality, and every single diagnosis is codified. So it basically lists the diagnosis, and then it says, if you have these criteria, then you have that diagnosis. And if anyone's ever taken a personality psychology class, they teach each of these diagnoses. And by the end of learning about all the diagnoses, when I did it, I think I had about 15 different diagnoses. But here's the thing. In 2013, this is huge. In 2013, just before the latest version of DSM came out, DSM-5, National Institute of Mental Health, and those are like the big wigs within the field. Those are like the czars of the field. They said they're no longer going to fund research based on the DSM symptom clusters. So they're no longer going to fund research based on depression and anxiety. And what was the reason they gave? Because the manual provides no data about the cause of psychological problems. So there's nothing in the manual about, so what causes this? Why are people experiencing these problems? This quote is amazing. So this is the most important psychiatrist in the whole country, the person who directs National Institute for Mental Health, Dr. Insel, 2013, right before the publication of the most important book in the field, says, the weakness of the manual is its lack of validity. This is heresy. This is like huge for the king to come out and say, the book that everything is based on is a lie. It would be like the Pope saying that the Bible is a lie. The weakness of the manual is the lack of validity. Unlike our definitions of lymphoma or AIDS, DSM diagnoses are based on consensus about clusters of symptoms, not any objective measures. And then this is the greatest part. Patients with mental disorders deserve better. He's calling out the whole premise of the field. This is tremendous, I think. So let's just look at the DSM criteria for major depression. So you have to have these four. Depressed mood or loss of interest in daily activities for 2 weeks. That's one criteria. Mood represents a change from a person's baseline. There's impaired functioning in these areas, and at least 5 of the symptoms below present nearly every day. So again, this is just looking at you're depressed if you have these symptoms. But what it doesn't tell you is more important than what it does tell you. It doesn't tell you why you're depressed. That's the million-dollar question is why you're depressed. Because if you don't know why you're depressed, how can you come up with a cohesive way of addressing depression? So what psychiatry has done has made a big bet, and they've said that depression is caused by low levels of certain chemicals called neurotransmitters. So these chemicals, again, many people have heard of: serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA. And I'll say more about these. So the question is, how well do you guys think that antidepressants work? Like, what does the public think? I think mostly the public thinks, especially if you haven't had a direct experience of it, that you're depressed, you go to your doctor, you take a pill, and in most cases you get better. And I've been around this field for a long time, and I would say that 50% of people, in my experience, this isn't scientific, but in my experience, 50% of people go to their doctor, they get Prozac, they get Zoloft, they get Wellbutrin, and 6 weeks later they feel better. So that means 1 out of 2 people. The other group goes back to their doctor and they say, I don't feel any better, doc. And the doctor prescribes another medicine, usually another class. They try another antidepressant, and then another, and then another, and then eventually they say, oh, you must have something other than depression. And they give you an anxiety pill, or they give you a pill for bipolar disorder. And there are many people out there that feel half-cocked, basically, and they're on 5 or 6 medicines. And in my estimation, that's not right. That shouldn't be happening. So back to the question about research on antidepressants, how helpful are they? So there was in January 8th, the New England January 2008, New England Journal of Medicine, there was an op-ed piece. And the op-ed piece spoke to the issue of research on antidepressants. And it said many antidepressant studies that don't achieve positive results never get published. So companies, so the people, the researchers that are doing this research are paid by mega corporations. They're paid by Pfizer, they're paid by Merck to do studies for them to prove that their drugs work. When the drugs don't work, they don't tell the public. And so drugs are approved by the FDA if they can find 2 studies that show they work. So a drug company might do hundreds of studies to find 2 positive studies so they can put it out to the market. And why is that? Because each drug that successfully makes it to the market is worth billions and billions and billions of dollars. So I always say doctors are rich. They can be millionaires. But there are no doctors, except maybe Dr. Phil, who can be billionaires. There's no billionaire doctors. So then someone got smart and they figured out a way to get access to as many studies as possible. They got access to all the published studies, and then they got access to as many unpublished studies as possible. And what do you think they found? This is 2010, so this is what, 7 years ago. They found that antidepressants that don't work any better than placebo for mild to moderate depression. They only work better than placebo when someone's severely depressed. So who's prescribed these medicines? Do you think it's only the severely depressed? No. Do you think that doctors even know that? Do you think your doctor that you go to when you're depressed knows about this 2010 study? Probably 1 in 50 do. Maybe 1 in 25, or maybe it's 1 in 100. I have no idea, but I guarantee that not every single doctor knows about this. So this quote from the Washington Post, this is 15 years ago. So this is old information. The majority of trials conducted by drug companies in the recent decades, sugar pills have done as well or better than antidepressants. Companies have had to conduct numerous trials to get 2 that show positive results, which is the minimum for FDA approval. This makes Prozac, the makers of Prozac had to run 5 trials to get 2 that were positive. So that's pretty troubling to me. So let's go farther with this. Are these drugs safe? So that's the first question to ask in medicine. Is an intervention, one is, does it work? The second one, is it safe? So the Hippocratic Oath says what? First, do no harm. So, okay, are they safe? According to the FDA, so according to the government, they're not actually safe for everyone that takes them. So I just want to say that I'm not anti-psychiatry. I think there's a place for psychiatric medicines in psychiatry for sure, but I think it's really important that anyone that gets a suggestion from a medical provider that they should consider taking a medicine should understand what they're stepping into. So this is a piece of information they should know about. So in March 2004, reports started to come in that there were problems. So this was even before. They decided to do something in March 2004. And they came out with the lowest level of public education. It's called a health advisory. And look at the side effects they started talking about. So anxiety, agitation, panic, insomnia, irritability, hostility, impulsivity, hypomania, and mania. So aren't those things that people are prescribed the medicines for? So people are getting side effects to the medicines that are actually a worsening of symptoms. So it's not uncommon for someone who goes to their doctor with mild to moderate depression. And part of the problem here is that most psychiatric medicines are actually prescribed by primary care visits after a 5 to 7 minute doctor's appointment. So that doctor really has no way of fully evaluating the person and whether an antidepressant makes sense. And they certainly have no way to do other things like lifestyle interventions, asking about sleep, asking about exercise, asking if something traumatic's recently happened. They just flatly don't have time for that. Not because they're bad people, but because the model doesn't support patients actually spending time with doctors actually spending time with patients to fully understand the scope of their issues. So then the black box warnings, later that year, things got worse. And they're like, we got to do something. So if you've ever seen a box of an antidepressant, it has a huge black box warning, sort of like what cigarettes have. You know, this is dangerous, and in some people is going to cause great harm. It doesn't mean, part of the problem here is, let's say 90% of people or 95% of people don't have horrible things happen. But what about the 5%? And how do you know if you're one of them? How do you know if you're going to be, or your kid, or your mother, or your father? So 2004, they issue a warning connecting antidepressants to kids. So people under 18, black box warning. 2 years later, they say, well, okay, it's also causing problems in people that are under 25. And the research now, they haven't come out with a warning yet, but there's a link to suicidality in a small population of people for anyone, adults that take antidepressants. So these drugs are dangerous for some people. So don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying that these drugs are dangerous for everyone that takes them. Because the obvious answer is, well, my Uncle Bill was really depressed. He got an antidepressant, and he was so much better. I see that happens all the time. But we need to think about, okay, what about the 5% of people or 2% of people that have serious problems? So then more and more data start to appear. And there's this emerging connection between antidepressants and suicide and violence. And if you have the stomach for it, there is a resource on the web called ssristories.com. And this is not for the faint of heart. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of media accounts that link medicines with violent acts. And these are just stories from the local paper in Omaha, Nebraska, or Portland, Oregon, about someone who started medicines and became homicidal. People could be homicidal and suicidal. And if you've ever met him up after and said, my daughter the dose, thinking that she needed more. 8 days later, they found her hanging in it. And why don't we know about it? We don't know about it because the pharmaceutical business is a big, big business. It's like big oil. These are really rich people that there are tens of thousands more stories like this, but they never make the press because most of them are settled for money out of court, and part of it is that there's a gag order so that they're not allowed to speak about it. Lawrence Hunter said, in virtually every mass shooting during the past 15 years, the shooter's been on or withdrawing from psychiatric drugs. When someone turns up in the emergency room psychotic, paranoid, manic, the first question they ask, first question paramedics are trained to ask, first questions emergency room doctors are trained to ask, did you start or stop an antidepressant? That's the first rule out. That doesn't mean every single person who presents in the emergency room with those issues is involving antidepressant, but it's a big enough issue that it's the first question they ask. Negative long-term effects. So in addition to the short-term, the acute effects, what the research is beginning to show is that there are many negative effects. There's cognitive effects, there's memory effects, there's effects on your body, on your kidney and liver. And if you're interested, these are the people to read. These are the last three are psychiatrists that have been writing about their field for the last 15 years. They've been trying to get the word out. And they are people that feel like they have the cure to cancer. They have information that's vital that never gets out there. So this talk, not because I'm special, but this is a talk there should be, 200 people at. This stuff's really important. And it's not only because I think it's important. I think that this is a public health crisis, actually. Anatomy of an Epidemic is a brilliant book. Robert Whitaker is a science writer that won the Pulitzer Prize for his investigation of the long-term ill effects of atypical antipsychotic drugs. So, based on all this information, psychiatry is totally changed, right? Everything is different now. Wrong. It's business as usual in mental health. It's as if none of this stuff has changed anything. So it's diagnosis based on symptoms without testing to determine the root cause. This is even with the most important psychiatrists publicly calling that out. It's medication as a tool, its main tool of treatment, in addition to psychotherapy. But the truth is, most people who go to a doctor for depression, for anxiety, they're not given a referral to a therapist. They're put on medicine. So this medicine, the research shows, works no better than a sugar pill for mild to moderate depression. That this medicine is life-threatening for some in the short term. This medicine is likely dangerous for many or most in the long term. So what does that mean? Why are doctors continuing to treat this as if it's the only solution? So the question I have, and I've had for years, is this the best we can do? Can we do better than this? We are better than this. We as a field are better than this. 95% of psychiatrists and therapists and psychologists went into this work with the desire to help people. So why aren't we more curious? And really, is there another way of looking at it? Is this the best we can do? I think this kind of sums it up. My desire to be well-informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. Change is hard. Being open to new information and figuring out new ways of doing stuff is hard. But we owe it, it's a great responsibility to step into people's lives and help them. So we owe it to them to feel uncomfortable, to figure out what's the latest, what's the greatest, and how do you tease out what's a hoax and what's for real. So what I'm going to present is a model I think is for real, actually. I think integrative and functional medicine is the greatest thing to happen to medicine in 50 years. Maybe even since penicillin, maybe since antibiotics. That this is a great development. So, I think I probably answered this question. Is it time for a paradigm shift? Yes, it's time for a paradigm shift. But is there grounds for a paradigm shift? Do we have some emerging sense of where this might take us? yes, it's going to take us deep into the existing medical literature. So the interesting thing about the medical literature, there are all these scientists that are writing about all kinds of things related to depression. And doctors are typically too busy to read them. So there's all this great stuff. So here's an example. It's now widely known that vitamin D levels are connected to depression. The medical literature, and so now probably like 70% of doctors, only 70, are testing for vitamin D levels. But maybe 10% of psychiatrists. But 90% of doctors are testing vitamin D levels. It was known among scientists 30 years ago that this is an important connection. It's all over the literature that this is an important connection. And the research shows that it takes 17 years for something that has been proven in the literature, in the journals, to make it into doctors' offices. 17 years is a long time. So the mainstream medical literature is full of peer-reviewed studies. Those are the kind of highest levels that look at underlying nutritional biochemical factors related to mental health. For the last 20 years, there's been laboratory tests available for many of these underlying factors so that they can be addressed using nutrition and medicine at some times. So the million-dollar question is, why doesn't psychiatry pay attention to its own literature and the literature of other mental health fields? So why don't more psychologists, so an example would be sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is where you stop breathing in your sleep and your brain doesn't get oxygenated and you don't sleep well. A known cause for mental health symptoms. Why don't all psychiatrists, why doesn't every single psychiatrist make sure that they've ruled out sleep apnea before prescribing powerful medicines? So this is kind of a talk about functional medicine. So what is functional medicine? So Mark Hyman is the chairman of the major teaching institution within functional medicine. He says functional medicine is the future of conventional medicine available now. It seeks to identify and address the root cause of the disease, and it views the body as an integrated system, not a collection of independent organs divided up by medical specialty. It treats the whole system, not just symptoms. So an integrative medicine or functional medicine doctor would say that issues of your GI tract, let's say bad bugs, dysbiosis, can cause depression. But if you went to an allopathic psychiatrist, they would never make that connection. So functional medicine solves two of the major problems of medicine. One is it sees the body as a whole. So it sees the concert between the different organs, the lymph system and the blood and the liver and the GI tract and the brain and the vagus nerve. And it understands problems in any place causing a symptom very far away. So depression can be caused by all kinds of things. It also doesn't treat symptoms. It doesn't say you're depressed, so we're going to give you a pill. It asks, why are you depressed? So you might think of it as the medicine of why. Okay, so you're depressed. What does that mean? And they're going to do testing to look at what might be causing it. So what would functional medicine bring to depression treatment? So in my mind, the thing it would do, the first thing is it would bring curiosity. So the thing that's most missing from medicine is the curiosity to try to understand causality. What's causing, okay, there's a person sitting in front of me, what's causing them to feel the way they are? Which part is psychological? Which part is their stress from work, which part is the way their liver is functioning. So here are some of the main imbalances that a functional medicine doctor would look at. And this isn't all of them. So what I'm giving is just kind of like an example. I'm introducing you to how a functional medicine person would think about these things. So neurotransmitter deficiencies, so deficiencies in certain brain chemicals, that can cause depression. But the question they would ask is, why? And I'm going to present a case that will speak to that. They would look at vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So there are many vitamins and minerals that have known connections with depression. So some of the obvious ones are vitamin D deficiency, vitamin B12, B6, vitamin B9, folic acid, zinc, and magnesium. And there are others, but those are some of the main ones. Deficiencies in essential fatty acids. So many of you have probably heard of omega-3s. Omega-3s, low levels of omega-3s are connected to depression. Gut issues, so bacteria and yeast overgrowth, parasites, things like celiac disease, food allergies, systemic inflammation. So those are just some examples. But what we're moving to here is a system of individualized medicine. So it's not like you're depressed and you're just given a pill, and every depressed person is given one of 5 pills. So if you understand the cause, then you can develop an intelligent treatment approach. So it's how do we, the doctors are, to get into medical school is one of the hardest things to do. But one of the things that doctors lose in medical school is curiosity. They lose the ability to think broadly and think critically. And some of that has to do with the model of medical delivery, where appointments are driven by insurance and they're often very, very short. So I just mentioned a whole bunch of causes. So psychiatry spends 95% of its energy focused on just one of those causes. So let's say I mentioned maybe 10 causes. Let's say that 80% of people have one of 20 or 30 causes that are driving their depression. And psychiatry focuses on one. And what they focus on are levels of brain chemicals called neurotransmitters. And they focus on them by raising levels of those chemicals using medicines. And so they're targeting specific pathways, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. But they never measure levels of these chemicals. So there's no test that they use to measure serotonin levels. So first, how do they know that that's what they should be treating? And the second thing they never do, or they rarely do, is ask why. What's downstream? Why is this presenting? Why does someone have abnormal brain chemistry? There's no doubt that they do in some cases, but the question is why. So one thing's for sure is that depression is not a Prozac deficiency. That's for sure. So this is a case that I saw that will elucidate. This isn't going to elucidate what it's elucidating a way of thinking. So this is a very, very typical person. So Jane, 42-year-old female, she's had depression, anxiety, and fatigue for years. She's been in the system for years. So she's like one of these people I was just talking about. She's been put on lots of medicines. Maybe they help for a little. They peter out. They put her on something else. Nothing's really helped. And once nothing's helped for a while, doctors and mental health folks, and I know that I can say this because I am one, don't necessarily like to feel helpless. So they sort of shut down after they sort of go through the rigmarole of what they typically do. So this was a patient who was, 60% better. And everyone was like, well, that's what you're going to get. That's about all you can expect. she was eating a good, clean diet. It would be a diet that would support mental health. And there's a lot of books that speak to what is a good mental health diet. One of them, for anxiety, a really good one is called the Anti-Anxiety Food Solution by Trudy Scott, and very simple, easy to understand. And another one is called, for depression, is called The Mood Cure by Julia Ross. So she came to us because she wanted to know why. Why am I not getting better? So here's what we did. We were curious, and we said, is it because she doesn't have enough of the basic precursors that are needed to make serotonin? So the most basic precursors are called amino acids. So amino acids are the breakdown product of protein. So you eat a steak, and your digestion breaks it down into these little itty-bitty things called amino acids. The only thing that serotonin can be made from is a specific amino acid called tryptophan. And everyone knows tryptophan. Everyone will say, the first thing they'll say is like, what's tryptophan? Tryptophan's in turkey. So tryptophan is in all proteins, all complete proteins. And it's the only thing that serotonin can be made from. So we gave her that test to assess her amino acid status. So does she have the raw materials to make serotonin? And then we gave her a test called the organic acid test, which is a urine test that looks at the byproduct of a whole bunch of different biochemical pathways of the body. One of those is neurotransmitter pathways. So from these two tests, we figured out she had low levels of the precursor. She had low levels of tryptophan, and she also had low levels of serotonin. So we then had an answer, at least a hypothesis. And what that suggested to me, so the next question I asked, of course, was why? Why does she have low levels of these basic building blocks? And the next thing to think about was, oh, I know why she has low levels. Her digestion of protein isn't working well. So what could we do about that? So here's what we did. So that's a hypothesis. So we came up with a hypothesis. This is what we think is going on. And what did we do? We gave her amino acids. So we could have given her tryptophan, but instead we gave her sort of a broad spectrum amino acid blend that had a lot of different amino acids. We also gave her digestive enzymes and stomach acid, hydrochloric acid, to help her break down the proteins. And what do you think happened? She felt better in 2 weeks. So she had been at 60%, she went up to 90%. And for her, the 60 to 90 was like a game changer. And was it because I was brilliant? No, I was just following an algorithm. I was just following what I had been taught, that we need to keep on asking why. So this is the serotonin pathway. You eat protein, it's broken down in the stomach by hydrochloric acid, and then you have amino acids. So there's L-tryptophan, which is broken down into something called 5-hydroxytryptophan, and then serotonin, feel-good chemical, and then melatonin. So with the help of digestive enzymes, with the help of hydrochloric acid, and specific vitamin and mineral cofactors, this process drives forward. So hydrochloric acid then becomes one of the key factors to understand when you're thinking about neurotransmitter deficiencies. So the only way that your steak, that your tofu, that your chicken can be broken down into the basic fundamental amino acids is with enough stomach acid. So if you have low levels of HCl, you're going to have poor digestion, low amino acids, low neurotransmitters, and it's going to lead to symptoms. So here's a sad thing, actually. So heartburn. So when someone presents to their doctor with heartburn, the treatment is typically to give a drug called a proton pump inhibitor, which shuts down the acid producing in the stomach. The sad part is that those drugs are rarely given without testing the levels of hydrochloric acid. So most people actually who have reflux have low levels of hydrochloric acid to begin with. So that's a serious problem. So people have low levels of hydrochloric acid, they're not breaking amino acids down. And amino acids, we're talking about depression, but amino acids are what builds muscle. Amino acids are what creates enzymes. So no amino acids, no life. I mean, they're called the building block of life for a reason. So one of the great tragedies is this lack of understanding of hydrochloric acid and what symptoms of reflux actually mean. So another rate limiting factor is vitamins and minerals. So without any of the cofactors that are used to make neurotransmitters, neurotransmitter production could stop. So neurotransmitter production could stop if you don't have enough tryptophan. But it can also stop if you don't have B6, B9, zinc, vitamin C, and copper. So any one of those deficiencies can lead to depression. So the picture is getting a little bit more complex here. So Prozac might help someone who has low levels of neurotransmitter a little bit, but it's not going to fix the problem. The only way to fix the problem is to identify the problem and then intelligently figure out what you're going to do. In this case, it's quite easy. If you figure out someone's zinc deficient, what do? You give them zinc. If you figure that someone is B6 deficient, what do? You give them B6. So, but unless you look, you'd never know that. And you couldn't possibly know that unless you test for it. I mean, there are very specific symptoms of zinc deficiency. So if you look at your nails and there are white flecks on it, like white spots, that's a symptom of zinc deficiency. Loss of smell, symptom of taste and smell, zinc deficiency. So, I mean, there are telltale signs, but the most important effective way to do it is to guess. I mean, is not to guess, is to test. So some of the tests we're talking about, so the amino acid test and the organic acid test, those are tests that some insurances won't cover, and they can be quite expensive. But every doctor can order B6, folic acid, zinc, vitamin C, and copper. It's not hard to do. But the problem I found is saying go to your doctor and have them test for X, Y, and Z, is that the doctor won't know what to do with it. And doctors don't like to do tests that are not meaningful to them. So, and which I understand, they shouldn't do tests that don't mean anything. And they shouldn't do tests that some therapist says they should do. I mean, that's sort of insulting. So what I'm going to do now is sort of go through some of the common underlying factors in depression, which I've started to do already, but I'm going to continue with that. So here are the psychiatric symptoms of a B12 deficiency. Look at them. They look like depression to me. Irritability, apathy, personality changes, memory loss, hallucinations, violent behavior, depression, dementia. So B12 levels are very dependent on proper digestion and something in digestion called intrinsic factor. This intrinsic factor, no, do you have the, or do you want to keep, has it been moving? Not at all? Oh, I thought you were going to move with me. Oh, okay. How about I'll take it? Perfect. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, so it stayed on the first one. Okay. Let's see. Wow, it's so much better with the visuals. Wow, that screen's nice. Okay, so we have the psychiatric symptoms. So these are the psychiatric symptoms of B12. So the question here, so Dr. James Greenblatt, who's my favorite probably integrative psychiatrist, because some integrative mental health practitioners are very anti-psychiatry, and this guy, he uses medicine when it's the best thing to use, and he uses testing and corrective supplements to enhance biochemical pathways when that's possible. So he's not bashing psychiatry. He's saying, yeah, he's really integrative. So he says the lack of understanding of B12 is one of the greatest tragedies in modern medicine. Oh, and I was saying that low B12 levels is an epidemic in the elderly. Every single person over 60 years old should be tested for B12 levels. And the presentation of low B12 is some of the stuff you see in old age homes, and dementia or psychosis or anxiety or depression. And wouldn't it be better if we thought to check B12 levels before using powerful medicines? B12 levels could fix the problem just as easily and make the experience way more pleasant for the person. But the question is, how many doctors are testing for it? And then it gets into another kind of interesting issue, which is what lab ranges are they using? So the ranges for B12, like the normal ranges for B12, are like 200 to 1,000. So people who have 204 aren't being treated for low B12, when in fact anyone below 500 needs to be treated. That 500 seems to be the mark at which that B12 might be involved with symptoms. So B12, and I'm not focusing on B12. So the thing is, this talk really isn't about B12. It's about being curious. And it's about starting with an algorithm. Like, you don't have to test everything. Testing everything would be impossible. No one has enough blood to test everything. But it's saying, okay, with the set of symptoms that someone's presenting with, what are the 20 things we're going to test? And starting with the things that are cheap. Starting with the things that any doctor can do. That cost a couple, cost $20, $10. Folic acid and depression. Oh, sorry. So, folic acid and depression. So low levels of folate, vitamin B9, are connected with depression, poor response to antidepressants, higher relapse rate for mental health patients. And the pharmaceutical business is beginning to understand that there's a role of nutrition or supplements in making sure their medicines work better. There is a pharmaceutical drug called Deplin, which is methylfolate, and it's often given to treatment-resistant people that aren't responding to antidepressants or bipolar drugs. And there are hundreds and hundreds, if you go into PubMed, supporting the relationship with adequate levels of folate and depression. So this study's fabulous. After 28 weeks of treatment with Prozac, they took folate levels. Relapse rates for patients with low folate were 42.9%. Relapse rates for subjects with normal folate, 3.2%. That's staggering. That's utterly staggering. So the question is, why isn't this standard practice? Why isn't it standard practice to take these really easily obtained laboratory measures? Zinc in depression. There was an article not too long ago that said, is zinc the new antidepressant? So low zinc is related to major depression. Zinc treatment's been shown to have antidepressant effects because it's one of, if you remember from a previous slide, zinc is one of the cofactors in moving tryptophan to serotonin. Big studies that look at lots of studies are called meta-analyses. So one that looks at 17 studies with 2,400 patients, again, showed that low serum zinc is correlated to depression. This is just a sampling of the literature. This isn't the definitive studies. This is basically to say there's evidence, and the evidence keeps on coming up. Every time they look, there's evidence. And I don't want to belabor the point, but maybe this is something we should be looking at. And if nothing more, to make medications work better. If we corrected all this stuff, the medications would work great. It would be fantastic. So many people would get better. Who's heard of lithium? Who knows that lithium is not a drug? So it's sort of ironic that the most important drug, quote unquote, in psychiatry is actually a mineral. So lithium, the drug, is actually a mineral. And everyone here probably in high school took chemistry, and if you look at the periodic table that has all the elements, number 7 is Li, lithium. And the cool thing is that the soda 7-Up is called 7-Up because up until the 1950s had lithium in it. So lithium is really, really interesting. So lithium, they don't really know exactly why it works, but they know it's anti-inflammatory in the brain. So it causes a decrease in inflammation in the brain. So there's some really crazy cool studies that look at, so one, they looked at the water supply. So the municipal water supply in every county in Texas. And there was a near perfect correlation between levels of lithium and violence and suicide. So places that had high levels of lithium in the water, so in the soil, had low levels of suicide and homicide. And places that had low levels had high levels of violence and suicide. That's pretty crazy. I mean, that is like no joke. A lot of the field right now is focusing on this connection between inflammation, systemic inflammation, and depression. So scientists are beginning to hypothesize that depression is actually a side effect of low-grade inflammation in the body and brain that's caused by some sort of chronic infective agent from all kinds of sources. It could be a physical injury, it could be an infection. Someone should tell me. Physical injury could be from allergies, it could be from gut dysbiosis. So they're starting to look at sickness behavior. So when people are sick, when they have inflammation, when they have the flu, when they have some sort of inflammatory condition, what do they look like? They look like a depressed person. All they want to do is sleep. They either want to eat too much or don't want to eat at all. They withdraw. They look depressed. So there's a lot of mounting evidence from this really interesting new field. There's a new field, sort of before functional medicine, called psychoneuroimmunology. So it's a field that's beginning to connect the mind with the immune system and the gut. And so what we've been missing in medicine that other fields of other kind of schools of medicine have, so Chinese medicine has a really good system of the body being an integrated system. Ayurvedic medicine from India, same thing. So the question is, do we have to guess or can we measure it? And there are a lot of ways to measure inflammation. A very simple way that lots of doctors do and can do It's called C-reactive protein. And this is a really easy way to measure whether you have any sort of systemic inflammatory process. There's a study that links depression to elevated CRP levels. It looks at pretty good sample, 508 healthy adults. Data collected at baseline and quarterly intervals throughout the year, so 4 samples throughout the year. And it showed pretty clearly that individuals with higher depression scores have higher levels of CRP. Again, I'm belaboring the point, but how many psychiatrists, how many mental health professionals are testing clients or patients for CRP levels? The mechanism here has to do with inflammatory substances called cytokines, and these are chemical messengers involved in immune response. And some of these are pro-inflammatory and some are anti-inflammatory. And research has shown that pro-inflammatory cytokines are significantly higher with patients with depression, and the anti-inflammatory cytokines are lower. So this is so cool that Zoloft seems that it decreases inflammation. So it decreases pro-inflammatory cytokines. So what if antidepressants are working in a large part because they decrease inflammation? I think that's pretty cool. And so they've looked further at this. So these pro-inflammatory cytokines activate an enzyme called IDO that degrades tryptophan, the precursor of serotonin, and serotonin as well. So what this does is lead to less tryptophan to make serotonin, and less serotonin, which leads to depression. So this is one way of connecting inflammatory response to depression. And so it's always most important to say, why is the person depressed? Why is serotonin low? Because if someone has an inflammatory condition that could be reversed, why would you enter the system upstream in the brain? The brain is so far away from the primary source. And if you fix the primary source, in all likelihood, you're going to fix the brain as well. So here's some just sources of inflammation. Standard American diet, toxins. We live in a highly toxic world. Infections. There's so many big new infective agents now. Candida is one, which is a yeast infection, Lyme disease. People have developed food allergies, stress, dysbiosis between good and bad bugs in the GI tract, different kinds of nutritional deficiencies, and inadequate sleep. So if we can identify the cause, then we can treat the problem. So this is just listing some natural tools that are used in the arsenal of integrative or functional doctors that are really highly research-based. The active ingredient in the Indian spice turmeric is called curcumin, and there's research that shows it works as well as Prozac for depression, 1,000 milligrams a day. There's tons of research looking at omega-3 oils. There's a doctor at Harvard named Dr. Andrew Stoll, who finds that high-dose fish oil is as effective as antidepressants, and he's using fish oil at really high doses, 10 grams a day. And then we spoke about lithium. There's research into lithium as being brain anti-inflammatory. Food allergies. There's different kinds of food allergies. There's the typical allergy, which is called an anaphylactic IgE allergy. Those are allergies that are very hard to miss. Kid eats peanuts, throat swells up, you have to give them an epinephrine shot. Those are typically not connected to mental health. Those are often dealt with quite easily, and they're identified because you can't miss those. You can't miss those. IgG allergies are different immunological responses. They might be referred to as delayed food sensitivities. So these are reactions of the immune system that are often connected to chronic illnesses, which mental health illnesses would be included in. And the interesting thing about IgG reactions is they're the foods we eat every day, and they're delayed. So you could eat, let's say you eat pizza on Monday, and you have a reaction to gluten, the protein in wheat, and on Wednesday you get depressed, or on Wednesday you get a migraine, or on Wednesday you feel fatigued. But what happens, do you think, when you eat those foods 2 or 3 times a day? If you eat wheat 2 or 3 times a day, and if you eat the standard American diet, likely you do, likely we all do. So is there research to back this up? So this is a profound one. So high IgG antibodies, so an immunological IgG to wheat were found in 87% of patients with autism, 86% with schizophrenia. High antibodies to casein, that's the protein in dairy, are found in 90% of kids with autism and 93% of people with schizophrenia. I've seen people improve tremendously if they find out that they have a gluten allergy, or they find out that they have a dairy allergy. And there's a way of finding out. The most effective way of finding out is doing what's called an elimination diet. So one of the best elimination diets is a diet called, the easiest to implement, it's called the Whole 30. And you can go to on the web, whole, WHOLE 30.com, and it removes all of the foods that are known allergens. So it removes wheat and dairy and corn and soy, which are the most allergenic foods, and then it lets you reintroduce them to see if symptoms first go away and then whether they come back. Candida. Candida is a yeast that grows in the GI tract. When it grows to large levels, it can cause clear neurological and psychiatric symptoms, including things that we're presented with in mental health every day: schizophrenia, chronic fatigue, Alzheimer's, depression, fibromyalgia, seizures. All of these in researches have been linked to a candida overgrowth. This study is crazy, just crazy. 84% of patients with chronic fatigue, they have a clearing of symptoms after antifungal treatment. So this is a drug called nystatin that treats fungal infections, including candida. So this is a dumb study. So this isn't looking to see if people have candida or not. This is saying the way you qualify for the study is to say you have chronic fatigue. Okay, we're giving you this drug. They never saw whether they had candida or not. So these are people highly impaired. They're on disability. There's 685 of them. 84% of them are able to come off of disability after a month of candida treatment. That is crazy. I mean, that just blows my mind. So could depression and chronic fatigue syndrome be a candida infection in some people? And the key thing is it's not our responsibility to say that depression's caused by the same thing for every person. It's our responsibility to be curious. But this study is saying, a huge percentage of chronic fatigue, in assuming that this is a pretty representative sample, that it's not just in these 685 people. So that's pretty amazing. I'm almost done. I think my point is made, I hope. So another very common GI, gastrointestinal bug is called Clostridia or C. difficile. And it has very clear, known psychiatric problems. And the mechanism here is that the bacteria inhibits an enzyme that converts dopamine to norepinephrine. So high levels of dopamine. So if you block this conversion, high levels of dopamine are created. So this could present as someone who's depressed. It can present as schizophrenia. It could present as autism. So the autistic community is very aware of this connection. This is really important for that community. It's the first thing, if you go to a knowledgeable doctor, that they'll rule out. So it's easy to measure. So remember we were talking about the organic acid test? There's a marker on the organic acid test for Clostridia. And so this is a small sort of study, not big enough to make huge conclusions, but it's pretty compelling. 11 autistic kids are given an antibiotic that targets C. difficile. Significant improvements were noted in several children. The researchers state these results indicate the possible gut flora-brain connection which warrants further investigation. So we're not being definitive here. Our job is, the field of functional medicine's job is to be curious and to never say, I give up. Because people's lives are literally at stake. That we can at least be willing to be uncomfortable and be curious. This is, I'm wrapping up here. This is the takeaway. These are the takeaways. That mood disorders and all mental health symptoms and all chronic diseases, and especially those chronic diseases that that are like kind of amorphous, that people get and no one really understands, things like chronic fatigue, that would be one of them. Fibromyalgia. I don't think there's probably such a thing as one cause of fibromyalgia or one cause of chronic fatigue. But the study that shows that Candida is responsible in this study for 80+% of people getting better is pretty compelling. So all the things that we're treating are just a cluster of symptoms that have been defined that can have numerous biochemical causes. That's one thing. It's impossible to tell what the root cause of any mental health diagnosis is based on symptoms alone. As Dr. Insel says, we as a field need to be focused on identifying causes, not just identifying symptom clusters. And though some tests are specialized, like the organic acid or genetic testing, or even IgG food allergy testing, there's so much that normal, typical doctors can do using LabCorp or Quest that can drastically improve outcomes. So my challenge, so there's probably a few, I know there are a few therapists in this room. My challenge to them and to everyone else is it's up to us to educate ourselves. The only reason I'm sitting here was because I was curious. I have no business being here, really. I'm a person who is a doctor who's a therapist, and I got curious when I started to see how not everyone was getting help, and I wondered why. And I was about 21, 22, and I started talking to my friends about it, colleagues, and they weren't really that interested. And I didn't know why they weren't interested. And I had never heard of functional medicine. I'd never heard of any of this. And actually, when I got into it, there was no word functional medicine didn't even exist. It was almost 20 years ago. But I'm sitting here now just because I'm curious. I'm not even that smart, but curiosity's taken me a long, long way. And I've become a person in Omaha that's willing to try to solve problems. And there are doctors across the country who are working to solve problems, to answer the question of why are you fatigued? Why are you depressed? Why, there's a million whys. And if we're not going to do it, who's going to do it? If we leave it up to the drug companies, unless there's a drug to treat it, unless there's $3 billion to be made a year, they're not interested. So their motivation, our motivation is different than their motivation. our motivation, they want to heal people, but they want to make money. And our motivation is we want to make a living doing this so we can pay our bills, but we're here to help. If you're interested in this field, I think it's extraordinary. I think it's the future of medicine. I think it's has the opportunity to change the world, to alleviate a lot of suffering. These are some books. So Mark Hyman was the man we were talking about, who's head of the Institute for Functional Medicine. He has a really good book on the application of functional medicine called the Ultramind Solution. There is a woman up in Minneapolis named Joan Matthews Larson, who her story is really interesting. She's probably in her 70s now, and her son was an alcoholic who went through a 30-day treatment program. He got out of the treatment program, and the day he got out, he shot himself and killed himself. And she was destroyed. And she single-handedly, on her own, set out to understand why her son killed himself, and has dedicated her whole life to making sure other people don't have to go what she's gone through. James Greenblatt, my favorite psychiatrist, he has a book called The Breakthrough Depression Solution. He just came out with a great book on attention deficit disorder. He has an amazing book on functional medicine treatments for anorexia. He's the real deal. There's a really good website that has a compilation. They have articles cataloged by really smart people. So if you have OCD, you can search, and there's 20 articles about OCD or depression or whatever. It's called alternativementalhealth.com. And if you're really into it, you can go to the Great Plains Laboratory, their website. They have hundreds of short videos with doctors, including Dr. Greenblatt and other kind of notable people, presenting on functional medicine. And it's a laboratory that started to answer difficult questions about autism. And they now sort of deal with mental health broadly. And this is just a little bit about me. So I have a practice here in town. Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you. So I have a practice over in Benson in the Omaha Yoga and Bodywork Center building. And I do some of this, or a lot of this, and I'm also a psychotherapist, and I create safe space for people to explore difficult issues and pepper some of this in when it makes sense. And I've started a new business called Integrative Depression Solutions, and I do functional medicine consults around the country. And the easiest way to get to my website is moodhealing.com. So are questions okay or no questions? So if anyone has questions, you can either do it publicly, you can come up and talk to me. And I just want to thank you for being such an attentive audience. It was really fun. Sir. So I think the question is, are there ways of helping people come off SSRIs to using nutrition? Yeah. So I think virtually every single person that starts a medicine, is probably deficient in some of this chemistry to begin with. So what I help people do typically is, by understanding what vitamins and minerals and precursors are needed, building those levels of tryptophan or 5-HTP, zinc, magnesium, can really help. Like if you do that for a month, and then people can come off of medicines much more easily. Anyone else? Oh, hi. Immune, like meaning do you reach tolerance and need higher doses? Sometimes. Yeah, there are other classes. So there's a class of drug called benzodiazepines. They're used to treat the anxiety, Klonopin or Xanax. Those more commonly are conventionally addictive medicines where you reach tolerance. But do people have to raise doses of antidepressants? Sometimes. But I wouldn't, they're not addictive in the same kind of way, I wouldn't say. Anyone else? Okay, that's it. That's a wrap.